Welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday, a lectionary podcast from St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm John Kennedy.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
And Peter Walsh is, of course, on sabbatical. So today we have the story of Jesus walking on water, one of his most iconic miracles. And it's a story that says something about who Jesus is, full of symbolism and imagery that's almost as powerful as the miracle itself. As well as a real sink or swim moment for Peter. So let's get into it. This is Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking towards them on the lake. But when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Okay, so where do we jump in?
Exciting, so to speak. Very
Yes.
funny. Well, this is the second storm in a boat story we have in Matthew, and all the Gospels have this story. Only Matthew has Peter coming out to walk on the water.
Right, yeah.
But, they've been here, they've been in this situation before. And so I don't know, it's a good summer story out on the sea. My translation says sea and yours says lake. And I guess, we know this is Galilee. So it's been referred to as different, both things. I think sea for me speaks to chaos and, the kind of primordial waters that Matthew might be alluding to here. And so I don't know, just pull that out as a notice. But I think that it's interesting too, this is already Matthew 14, and in the sequence of events, Jesus has just been feeding the crowds on the hillside. And as we've talked about at various points in this podcast about Matthew, he is pretty overtly recreating a Torah type of body of work here, where he's got the Mosaic teachings, and Jesus here has 5 sections of grand teachings, and also Jesus is portrayed as like a new Moses, and so there he was feeding the crowds on the hillside, sort of like Moses feeding the people in the wilderness with manna, and and after that Joshua comes and tries and leads the people across the Jordan River into the Promised Land. So one commentator has talked about this scene in Matthew as Jesus kind of becoming the new Joshua, where he's making his disciples get in the boat and go on ahead to the other side. I mean, in a way, that's like a mashup of Moses and Joshua, because then Jesus goes up the mountain, whereas Moses went up to die and disappear after sending the people off to the Promised Land. Here, Jesus goes up to pray, and there's an emphasis here. He's alone, he's by himself. The boat is far from the land, this emphasis on their separation. But Jesus is up there to pray and, acknowledge his intimacy with God and calm himself, from the crowds and all their adoration from his miracle in the wilderness.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting setup. Maybe that's what Matthew's up to here is kind of recreating this narrative of getting the people into the promised land. Yeah. And then we won't have heard the feeding of the 5,000 because, the Feast of Transfiguration falls on the week before this. So it's a little messed up. But in Matthew, that's what's happening.
Right.
And then the next week, and then I'll stop talking, we get Jesus and the disciples ministering in Gentile territory. So that sort of motif might continue, that Joshua leads people into the land of Canaan.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
Immediately Jesus in Matthew 15 has an encounter with a Canaanite woman,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So it's sort of
that's good.
interesting. I felt
That's
that
really
was
interesting.
pretty enlightening to read it this way.
I'm glad that Jesus doesn't go into the Canaanite land to kill them all.
I know,
unlike
it's totally
the other Joshua.
Yeah.
And I say other
exactly.
Joshua because, of course, Jesus and Joshua actually have the same name. It is the same name. Jesus being the Greek form of Yeshua, a Hebrew name, Joshua. And it means the word that it's derived from, Yasha, means he saves.
Yeah,
so that is the
exactly.
name of Jesus, Savior, very appropriate. And here we have Peter saying to Jesus when he is sinking, Lord, save me. Not accidental at all. I mean, what's so striking about this passage is how well it's composed. Nothing's accidental. It's so rich in Old Testament allusions, which you've already gotten into. So perhaps I might just sort of dive in. I'm going to stop with those jokes at some point and talk more about what I noticed. So you mentioned the primordial waters. That is, of course, a biblical motif going back to the very first verse of the Bible in Genesis chapter 1 with the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. And this is sort of this formless void, this chaos.
Right.
Water was scary to people in the ancient Near East because, water is scary. It's dangerous. It's it gets stormy as it does in this passage, and if you're in a boat, especially in those days, ship making being what it was, you're especially vulnerable to dying. Is really what it comes down to, I guess. Right. And it's unknown, and in ancient cosmologies, maps of the world or understandings of the world, certainly in this part of the world, they thought the world was sort of enclosed by waters because they didn't know what, if anything, was beyond all of that water.
Right.
And it wasn't until Magellan and Columbus and so on that we got a bit more clarity on what's out there.
Exactly.
Obviously there were progressive steps towards mapping and discovering the world from that perspective, because of course there are already people here and so on. Not really the new world, but new to people coming from Europe and so on. But anyway, so water is this very rich symbolism, and it's threatening, it's chaotic, it's unknown. And Jesus, as you said, for the second time in the gospel, certainly in this gospel, Jesus demonstrates his power over that force of nature, of creation, identifying him in some way with God, the Creator, who alone, the scriptures say has power over such powerful forces of nature like water.
It said somewhere that this feat of walking on water was always reserved for deities from the Epic of Gilgamesh onward.
Yeah.
So this is a clear kind of
definitely a motif,
deific moment.
Yeah. And in a psalm I have here, Job talks about God trampling the waves of the sea. It's chapter 9. And in Psalm 77, it says, God's way was through the sea, God's path through the mighty waters, yet God's footprints were unseen. So you can imagine all of this being very much in the mind of Matthew and at both, and I would say the tradition that Matthew is drawing
Absolutely.
on. that Jesus is being revealed here. So we're starting to see who Jesus is at this point in Matthew's gospel. At least people are starting to see it, or at least his disciples are starting to see it. I mean, Matthew's narrative starts, Jesus the Messiah and so on, and the genealogy and the miraculous birth. So that's clear from the beginning, but it's being made clear to his disciples at this point in the story. Even though last week we talked about transfiguration, it actually happens a little bit later, not much later.
Right. Yeah. And that last week was taken from Luke, so we kind of missed the Matthew version for our feast day.
Yeah.
But yeah. Right. I mean, there's so many beautiful Psalms that are evocative here. And Psalm 69 is, save me, Lord. Exactly what Peter's saying. Save me, Lord. The waters have risen up to my neck.
Right.
And then, as you mentioned, Psalm 77, and then there's Psalm 107. He makes the storm calm. They were glad because he brought calm, and he brings them to their desired haven. And then we have the idea of Noah and not succumbing to the storm, and Jesus. You mentioned water and those chaotic waters of creation and all that. I think that the boat has always been a symbol for the church. And so here in Matthew, there's also this mix of alluding to the church's struggle and the church's being battered by waves and chaos and fear and feeling alone and all those things. And Jesus, he sends them into the boat. He has promised at the beginning of this gospel he'll be with them always. Emmanuel, God is with us, and at the end, I am with you always, even to the end of the ages. So, he separates for a moment to get them to the other side, but his intention is always to be with them in the boat, right? Yeah. And so here, their second time around in a storm, they're not quite as afraid of the sea, but when they see him coming, they're terrified of the ghost. There's a point made that it's early in the morning, which is like before dawn, and somewhere I said that somewhere I read that's prime time for demon and Satan activity to kind of roam the world and do their havoc.
Interesting. Yeah.
Between 3 and 6 a.m.
Right. Yeah, the fourth watch.
Yeah. So there's Jesus, and they think it's a ghost, and they cry out in fear. And here's Jesus, take heart, it is I. Here's your allusion to, us finding out more about who Jesus is. And
very significant.
Yeah, that kind of Yahweh self-title.
I am.
Do not be afraid. Yeah. Powerful. And so you want to talk about Peter getting out of the boat?
Sure, yeah. So this only appears in Matthew, and it's a really interesting story because Jesus says, come out of the boat. I mean, in response to Peter's sort of, impulsive, characteristically impulsive, impetuous nature, he says, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And fairly ridiculous request, perhaps, but nonetheless, Jesus says, come to me. So Peter starts going, and as we have it in the story, he actually makes it a little bit, and then he sinks.
Right.
He notices the strong wind. He becomes frightened and begins to sink, and cries out, "Lord, save me!" I mean, this is fascinating. It's because Matthew places the greatest emphasis on the centrality of Peter in the early church. You are the rock on which this church will be built, and so on. And yet, Peter is not spared the unflattering depiction he gets throughout the Gospels in Matthew's Gospel. I mean, he's not somebody full of power and faith and virtue at this point in the story. His importance to the life of the church clearly doesn't rest on things like that. It rests on the power of Jesus, which is given to Peter. So at first he's able to go with it a little bit, but then he becomes frightened and starts to sink. I mean, this is so relatable. It's just like so spot on as far as human psychology goes that, once we begin to doubt or second guess or just sort of get out of the moment of whatever it is we're doing, like, it happens all the time in golf for sure, that the less you think, the better you do, usually.
Zen of golf.
Exactly, yeah. It reveals you to yourself.
Well, Well, here, I mean, special as Peter is, I think in Matthew, he's archetypal for maybe
indeed.
all the disciples. And he's got this, people love to call him impetuous and all that stuff, which he might be. But he's also got this beautiful willingness to jump in with Jesus. Another bad pun. It's completely unnecessary for him to. Jesus is on his way to the boat, right? And I guess James Allison is one who emphasizes this idea that Jesus is reenacting this Joshua scene of, and maybe Peter kind of half gets that Jesus is doing something like this, or there's more than meets the eye here, and Peter's like, well, I should be out there with you, I have the keys to the church or whatever. He wants to be right next to Jesus. So maybe who knows why he wants to walk on the water, but he wants to be with Jesus, and Jesus, of course, invites him to come. But I think that when Jesus says to him, "Why did you doubt?" This word doubt it's used twice in Matthew, and it's distazo. It's a different form of doubt than skepticism. It's more like, vacillation or wavering. And the second time it's used, the second and only other time it's used is in Matthew, and it's in the presence of the resurrected Christ, when it says, and some doubted, and we always do. Like, we have this mix of like wavering and intention, wavering and commitment. And it's just the way we are. It's really hard to be all in when there's so much swirling against us. And I feel like that's where Jesus meant for Peter to stay in the boat, stay the course. And I think that for us, the church, it's easy to kind of get out and go try to hunt Jesus down in other places and not really believe that he's there in the boat with us, or that he has, he's too far away, or, I don't know what. We feel alone, we feel rocked, abandoned. And maybe Jesus is saying, why did you doubt? You could have stayed in the boat, That's where the work is, and we're heading that way. We're not heading this way, So I like that interpretation.
Yeah, that is interesting.
I find that really helpful. And I remember my early childhood Sunday school teachers always, we were always drawing the pictures and coloring Peter on the water and, afraid he's drowning. And then, so that's that's the like typical teaching for kids is, if he hadn't doubted, he could have walked all the way to Jesus and stayed dry, but it's really to what end, they're both going to climb back in the boat. So I really feel there's power to that, where Jesus is saying, why did you think you needed to come out?
I like that. Yeah.
And so that's some good richness there. I love that.
There really is. Yeah. I'd never thought about that question of Jesus to Peter, why did you doubt, as being applied to his request to come out there to see if it's really Jesus in the first place. I totally have read it in relation to the walking on water, or failure to walk on water. And I do like that because, walking on water is not something that like the apostles do subsequently. Like Paul is shipwrecked, but like his thought isn't like, well, I can walk along the water. I mean, clearly this is a symbol, not to say it's not historical, but it's at least a symbol of Jesus's identity, his divine identity, because of the Old Testament allusions that we've already looked at. I think that's really good. I love this church as the boat, or boat as the church imagery as well. And when I was looking at this, noticing the juxtaposition or the sequence rather of the feeding of the 5,000 and this story of the walking on water, that I was thinking about something that really connects to that metaphor of the boat as the church, which is, of course, the feeding of the 5,000, maybe not of course, but that has Eucharistic symbolism. Of course, the bread being given to all, and that echoing the manna in the desert from the Israelite wandering times with Moses in the Torah. So if the feeding of the 5,000 is representative of the Eucharist, then this is perhaps representative, this story is representative of the church's life after, the ascension, where we don't see Jesus, we don't really know where he is all the time, or at least we we waver on our knowledge or trust of where Jesus is, and we become afraid and we get battered by the waves and the storms, the chaos of life. But periodically, Jesus does come to us in the Eucharist, and sustains us and leads us along. To we actually don't get the part about them making it to dry land in this particular, the way that this is showing up in the lectionary, but that is the next thing. They just make it to dry land safely. So I think that's, there's so much there. My imagination is certainly, when I think about application to my life and to people's lives generally, is with this idea that Jesus, even with what we've already said about the walking on water, Peter's walking on water, and the wisdom of it, that we can actually do a lot more than we give ourselves credit for. That this is a story about Jesus's power and identity and centrality, and that our power arises from Jesus's power, and a call to believe in the power of Jesus as the Son of God, which is the confession the disciples make at the end of the story. But it's also, I believe, a story about Jesus's belief in us in a way, to follow him, to be like him in certain and real ways, and how what gets in the way is not him but us.
Right.
That's
especially
the limiting
when we get
factor.
Out of the boat.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, you're going to have a lot to work with on this one. So,
Indeed.
I wish you good Godspeed on writing a sermon on this one. It's rich.
I think we've covered basically all of it. I mean, there's always more.
Touched on, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Should we say skimmed the surface?
Skimmed the surface. Nice. Okay. Well, I hope you've enjoyed skimming the surface with us, and that it's inspired you to go deeper in one way or another. And we look forward to seeing you next time. So thank you for joining us, and like, comment, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time.
See you in church. Thanks.